8 o'clock and welcome to another episode of Marvelous Medicine. Today is about nutrition in surgical patients, and I couldn't think of anyone better than Dr. P.C. Vijaykumar to deliver the talk. He's the director, academics, and chief anesthesiologist and critical care physician at Surya Hospital, Chennai. He did his MBBS from Chengalpet Medical College and a diploma and DNB in anesthesiology from Madras Medical College. Dr. Vijay Kumar is the National Vice President of IAPEN, that is Indian Association of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, and the Chairman and Executive Director of ERAS India. And his hospital is a IAPN Center for Advanced Learning in Critical Care Nutrition. Dr. Vijay Kumar has always been an early adapter of all techniques and concepts in anesthesia, intensive care, pain medicine, and nutrition. And he's a sought after speaker in national and international forums. Thank you, Dr. Vijay Kumar, for readily accepting my invitation and joining us today. Moderating the session will be Dr. Krishnan Sriram. He's currently a tele-intensivist with the U.S. Veterans Affairs Telemedicine Service at Chicago. He did his MBBS from Madras Medical College and his surgical residency and critical care training with the Chicago Medical School, where he stayed on as faculty. Board certified in general surgery and surgical critical care as well as nutrition. In between several faculty positions in the US, he spent a decade in India as an honorary professor of surgery, surgical intensive care, and nutrition, and spearheaded ISPEN activities. Dr. Sriram is a member of various societies and serves on the editorial boards of several journals. He has been involved with the Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition Society of Asia from its inception and is currently an advisor. He has several publications and presentations at national and international meetings, and his main interests include early enteral feeding, oral nutritional supplements, micronutrients, and utilizing telemedicine for nutrition education and patient care. Welcome, Dr. Sriram, and thank you once again for readily accepting my invitation. Joining Dr. Sriram will be Dr. Biju Kottakat. He is the professor and head of the Department of Surgical Gastroenterology at JIPMER Pondicherry. Biju did his MBBS from University of Calicut and his MS from Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. After that, he moved on to Lucknow, where he did his MCH in surgical gastroenterology and postdoctoral fellowship in hepatopancreatic and biliary surgery at Sanjay Gandhi Postgraduate Institute of Medical Sciences. After that, he moved to Japan and also spent some time in US doing hepatopancreatic surgery. He did his fellowship in liver transplant surgery at the Asian Center for Liver Disease and Transplantation at Singapore. He's an editorial board member of the Science Publishing Group and was a reviewer in more than 11 index journals. He has published more than 100 papers in index journals and authored 3 chapters in books. However, today he's joining us due to his special interest in nutrition in surgical patients. Over to you, Dr. Vijay Kumar.
Thank you very much, madam, for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. Is my slides are visible?
No, sir.
No.
No.
Yeah, that's all. Is it okay now?
Yeah, you can just go on to slideshow. Yeah.
So once again, good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to meet you all in this evening to give a talk on the topic nutrition in surgical patients. To start with, so the first and utmost important motto of this particular lecture is, we must improve perioperative nutrition. So when the operation comes, And when the patient gets admitted into the hospital, this is the statistics says in United States of America. 2 out of 3 patients coming for gastrointestinal surgery are malnourished at the time of surgery. 3 people, the greater risk of having a complication if malnourished at the time of surgery, and 5 times risk more likely to die than well-nourished patients. Only 1 in 5 hospital patients are getting the nutritional screening process, and only 1 out of 5 patients receives any pre-operative intervention. And 3 out of 4 surgeons believe perioperative nutrition delivery will reduce complications, but many of them are not practicing it. But as far as the economic is concerned, every single $1 spent on nutritional therapy in the hospitalized patient can save $52 in hospital cost. So knowing all these statistics, even though we don't have any such statistics in India, you can imagine when this scenario is like this in United States of America, if you do the real statistics in India, we have to improve more in the perioperative nutrition. Surgery and the nutrition are linked together, bonded together very much. Surgical patients are at risk of nutritional depletion because of an inadequate intake before and after surgery. And because of the disease impact itself, they will be nutritionally depleted. And if you subject them for a surgical procedure, the stress for the surgery is very much high, and the depletion of the nutrition is also more. And we all understand and we all accept, most of the people who are attending this webinar today will accept that if any patient comes to us with the undernutrition, the risk of postoperative complications are very high. And better outcome if malnourished patients are fed for 7 to 10 days prior to surgery, everybody will accept, but we are hesitant to practice that, the preoperative nutritional care. Paul Wischmeyer rightly said, the malnutrition is an emergency in surgery. If a patient comes to the surgery and with the nutritional screening, if you're finding them as malnourished patient, then it is an emergency in surgery. Though the albumin and the nutritional status with the nutritional screening preoperatively, only modifiable risk factor which you can understand, but we can affect preoperatively to reduce the mortality if we have a screening and screen them as a malnourished patient. Each and every surgical incision matters as far as the surgery is concerned. But the same surgery and the incision can cause so much of effects inside our body due to the release of stress hormones and inflammatory markers that will produce the insulin resistance, and they start mobilizing the energy substrates inside the body and end up in having the negative nitrogen balance. And it also suppresses the immune system. And when the surgical incision makes this so much of effects inside the body, it is our duty to counteract very nicely. And what you and me are practicing till today in the perioperative care, I can label it as a traditional perioperative care. And the 3 important aspects which we are still in the tradition is, one is the starvation during the perioperative period. And this starvation is not the patient starving, but the starvation is prescribed by the physician and by the surgeons during the perioperative period. And the stress is so much during the surgery, and due to the incision and due to immobilization and pain, all these things increases stress on this patient, and the entire ERAS protocols is rolled around this particular factor to reduce the stress in the perioperative period. And if you reduce the stress in the perioperative period, you can enhance the recovery after the surgical procedure. And the third important thing is, all our patients during the perioperative period, we prescribe them more fluids, and they really drowning in the IV fluids in the perioperative period. So we need a change in our practice from the traditional perioperative care. We have to move on to the newer change in our practice, nutritional practice. And there are two important people in the perioperative period taking care of the surgical patients need to be changed. One is the anesthesiologist, and second comes the surgical population. Let us start with this Mendelssohn syndrome. The prescription of starvation or the overnight starvation for all the surgical patients have come from this particular syndrome, the Mendelssohn syndrome. And now in 2021, it is actually the 75th anniversary after the publications of New York Obstetrics and its classical paper by the Mendelssohn. The aspiration of stomach contents into the lungs during obstetric anesthesia causing mortality in the obstetric patients coming for a cesarean section. And he concluded that gastric retention of solid and liquid materials in prolonged during labor and also before the surgical procedure that leads to the aspiration of vomiters into the lungs, and that can occur when the laryngeal reflexes are abolished during the ether anesthesia. The respiratory failure secondary to aspiration pneumonitis during anesthesia became a synonymous with Mendelssohn syndrome, and the anesthesiologists took it in their hands and they thought that the prevention is the cornerstone of the anesthetic practice. But the 60 years after the Mendelssohn paper presented in the New York Society of Obstetrics, and this has been disproved at the 60th year of this Mendelssohn syndrome, and they concluded with a key point saying that the residual gastric volume and pH, the two surrogate endpoints of the aspiration risk, are determined by oral intake, gastric secretion, and gastric emptying. Gastric emptying of liquid is an exponential process. The off time of water is about 10 minutes only. It is wrong to regard the stomach as either empty or full, and induction of anesthesia safe or unsafe. There are only three risk factors for aspiration during the perioperative period and anesthesia. The one is emergency surgery, and the second one is the light anesthesia, and third one is unexpected responses to the stimulation leading to the vomiting reflexes, producing vomiters and gastric aspiration. So when the Mendelssohn syndrome is nullified, we used to prescribe the starvation just before the surgical procedure only for 4 hours for the breast milk and 6 hours for the food, including the milky drinks, and it's only 2 hours for the water and clear fluids. There is no point of keeping our patient in overnight starvation. And we go beyond that. Instead of keeping them starvation, we used to load them with carbohydrates and water just 2 hours before the surgical procedure. And what is it actually, the carbohydrate loading in the ERAS protocol? It's actually giving the patient 100 grams of glucose, 100 grams of carbohydrates in the concentration of 12.5% in the volume of 800 ml just previous day of the surgical procedure. And just 2 hours before the procedure, 50 grams of carbohydrate in the same 12.5% concentration, half of the volume, 400 ml, just before the surgery is the carbohydrate and water loading. Remember, this carbohydrate is actually the complex maltodextrin and not the plain glucose what you and me imagine to give to the patient. Because the maltodextrins having the osmolality of less than 285, and that promotes fast gastric emptying. So when we don't have the complex maltodextrins commercially to practice the carbohydrate loading, we used to give the glucose to the patient in the same volume of water just 4 hours before the surgical procedure. But fortunately, now there are many commercial preparations available for this procedure and for this purpose. What are the advantages of giving the patients just before a surgical procedure with a carbohydrate and water loading? It gives the satisfaction to the patient and it decreases the stress on them. And surprisingly, it decreases the insulin resistance. Many of the diabetologists and even a diabetic patient used to ask us, what is the meaning of giving a glucose for us when we are a diabetic patient on insulin? Surprisingly, this carbohydrate loading and water loading, it decreases the insulin resistance, and you can see the nice glycemic control in the perioperative period. and don't afraid of the increased GRV and the risk of aspiration during your induction of anesthesia. And it reduces 20% time in the hospital stay and 50% reduction in the insulin resistance, and it preserves the lean body mass. That means it preserves the catabolism during the surgical procedure. And to achieve a good nutritional support or to achieve the early enteral feeding after the surgical procedure, and it is the time for the anesthesiologist to say no to the pre-medication. And traditional pre-medication cocktail, if you see, we used to sedate them pre-operatively. Just 12 hours before, the overnight we want to sedate the patient and to bring them to the operation table sedated. And we used to pump them with the H2 and proton inhibitors, and we used to give prophylactic antiemetics, and used to give them the anti-silacoc, and even the narcotics are given prophylactically. But in case of, to avoid the surgical starvation in the postoperative period, you have to practice no pre-medication. Since the admission is going to be the day of the surgery in the ERAS protocol, there is no need to pre-medicate before the night. And sedatives, remember, it delays the recovery, and recovery from the sedation, it prolongs. No role for the prophylactic antiemetics, gastric acid suppressions, delays appetite. So the patient will not have the appetite in the postoperative period. So the early enteral feeding is getting delayed. And the same way, if you put the patient on the anti-silacoc, they will have a distaste because of the drying of the secretions and because of the decreasing the salivation, and it causes a definite dysphagia in the postoperative period. And there is no use of preemptively using the narcotic analgesia just before the incision, not a day or hours before incision. So hence, kept together, there is no role for any pre-medication in the surgical patients if you're aiming for the enhanced recovery after the surgical procedure. And if you really want your surgical patients to take early enteral nutrition immediately after the surgical procedure, it is the duty of anesthesiologist to prevent the postoperative nausea and vomiting on them. So we have to assess the patient like nutritional assessment. We have to assess them whether they have the highest risk factors for a PONV. Younger the patient, female, obese people, anxiety, motion sickness, and the previous postoperative nausea vomiting are the definite risk factors for the postoperative nausea and vomiting. Then instead of general anesthesia, the anesthesiologist to prefer total intravenous anesthesia and avoid narcotics, volatiles, and of course the nitrous oxide also. And the reversal with the neostigmine can produce postoperative nausea and vomiting. So we have to practice a narcotic-free analgesic techniques and total intravenous anesthesia, lesser amount of muscle relaxants for us not to reverse them with neostigmine after the anesthesia. And in the postoperative period, use liberal antiemetics like a multimodal analgesic treatment. It is a multimodal prevention of emesis in the postoperative period. So club steroids, ondansetron, metoclopramide or domperidone, in the combination of drugs, if you aim in the postoperative period, that will definitely nullify the nausea and the vomiting in the perioperative period. And just move on to the perioperative prescription of IV fluids and its nutritional values. It definitely produces the caloric deficit on our surgical patient and end up in having a poor surgical outcome. Let us discuss what do you really mean by caloric deficit on our surgical patients. We take this case as an example. It's a post-operative GI surgical procedure on NPO without enteral access like Ryle's tube, jejunostomy, or any enteral feeding tubes. So naturally, we tend to prescribe them only the IV fluids or otherwise parenteral nutrition. He is a 50 kilogram individual for our better calculation and understanding. The nutritional requirement per day, we can easily calculate like this. Let it be the 30 kilocalories of non-protein in a 50 kilogram individual, So 1,500 kilocalories in the form of non-protein calories. And if we aim for a 1.5 grams of protein in a 50 kilogram individual, it will give 300 kilocalories. So our aim is to give him actually 1,800 kilocalories per day. If you prescribe them the DNS Isolatium, 3,000 ml per day, but you can see many prescription in the post-operative period have the combination of all type of IV fluids, normal saline 1 pint, ringer lactate 1 pint, yeah, DNS 1 pint, like that the combination of IV fluids sometimes skip the continuous supply of glucose to the patient. But I am giving you a good example of a fluid which contains dextrose and which contains the electrolytes in the normal proportion. So it's basically a dextrose and electrolyte solution prescribed 3,000 ml per day. And it contains only one nutrient, the carbohydrates, in the measurement of 150 grams. So it can give you 600 kilocalories per day. It is the nutritional value of your prescription, this IV fluid. The glucose and electrolyte solution will give the patient actually only 600 kilocalories per day. So the patient end up in having 1,200 kilocalories as a deficit. So we can take this as a caloric deficit. And just imagine the same patient is going to have only the carbohydrate and electrolyte solution for 5 days. There will be a definite cumulative caloric deficit, comes around 600 kilocalories. And if the patient gets the 6,000 kilocalories from the proteins alone, not from the fat, then it's going to be 1.5 kilograms of proteins. And we all should understand how our body will utilize the substrates, the nutritional substrate utilization in a catabolic and non-catabolic individuals. For example, if we take a starvation, simple starvation, they are non-catabolic. First, they will exhaust their carbohydrates, then they will deplete the fat, and the last only they will touch the proteins in them. But the same patient, if you have the sepsis or you have a systemic inflammatory response like pancreatitis, if they go for a surgery or the trauma, the substrate utilization is totally changing. And before they get exhausted their fat, they start exhausting the proteins. So that is what happening in obese individuals, the bariatric surgical population. When they come for a surgical procedures, we may think that they are obese. What is the big loss we are going to have when they are going to deplete their weight? But actually they become sarcopenic. They will lose their proteins, leaving the fat. They will start depleting the proteins, end up in having a severe catabolism. Naturally, the body will compensate this caloric deficit. We cannot identify this caloric deficit by any biochemical values, but they're all compensating from their own lean body mass, from their own organ proteins. And if not that much of proteins, then they will deplete their own fats. And this itself can lead to multi-organ failure and end up in having the mortality. So the cumulative caloric deficit should be avoided. Let us see, if you are prescribing only the dextrose containing fluid as a sole energy to your surgical patient, what are the ill effects? We all know hyperglycemia will be the problem, and the hyperglycemia will definitely impair the immunity. And the carbohydrates, the end products of carbohydrates is carbon dioxide and the water. And more carbon dioxide is produced and your respiratory system has to work more. And that increased sympathetic activity will lead to metabolic stress, and more water production will lead your patient to have a water retention. And to metabolize carbohydrates, we need phosphate, and they will have a hypophosphatemia, and that reduces the tissue oxygenation by moving the oxygen dissociation curve to the left side. And remember, by giving our patients continuously with only the carbohydrate solution, they will end up in having the real problem of fatty liver. So it is not due to the increased intake of fat that our patients are end up in having a fatty liver, but it is due to more and more of carbohydrates. If you are taking, they will have a lipogenesis and lead to fatty liver. And this carbohydrates will leave your patients with an essential fatty acid deficiency that can lead to poor wound healing. So what we have to do? Just imagine if you add fat emulsions to the prescription, the IV fluid prescription, these are all the benefits we are getting it. Decrease respiratory stress. It improves the nitrogen utilization better. So protein is spared. Optimal resistance to infection will develop because of the good glycemic control and decreases the water retention. And it indirectly enables partial parenteral nutrition. And it prevents, and at the most, it also reverses the fatty liver. So depending upon the diabetic status of your patient, you can distribute the fat and the carbohydrates in the ratio of 50-50, 60-40, or 40:60. So the caloric deficit by adding lipid emulsion in the IV fluid prescription is decreased. For the same example of glucose and electrolyte solution of 300 ml, aiming to have 1,800 kilocalories, by adding 20% of the intralipid 300 ml per day, 60 grams of protein is delivered. That gives 540 kilocalories per day, so that the patient will have only the 660 kilocalorie deficit per day. Hence, caloric deficit decreases by adding fat emulsions on them. And luckily, we have multiple bottles, the varieties of lipid emulsions, soya oil prepared, and olive oil preparation, pure fish oil emulsions, and interestingly, a good combination of all these things will have the SMOF oil emulsions. The SMOF oil is a combination of soy oil, coconut oil, olive oil, and fish oil, and this is the fat emulsion of choice now in a surgical patients. What will happen in the place of fat? In addition to the carbohydrates, if we give the proteins to our surgical patients, adding proteins after giving adequate calories only will reach exactly to your surgical patient, not before that. If you're not addressing the caloric need of the patient in the form of non-protein calories, your proteins will get utilized for our day-to-day energy of your surgical patients, and actually the catabolism will never be addressed. So add at least 1.5 grams per kg per day of proteins after addressing your patient the carbohydrates and fat in the IV fluids. And this is the combined nutrition, a sample of combined regimen should be followed in the perioperative period. Just an example, the 1,800 kilocalories in a 50 kilogram individual is the calculated caloric requirement of your surgical patient. The days after the surgery, the first day, the entire 1,800 kilocalories is given in the form of parenteral nutrition. On the second day, if they are able to get anything orally, and partially will be covered by the enteral nutrition, and the remaining thing by the parenteral nutrition. And slowly, when the patients start taking their oral intake, step by step, our ultimate aim to achieve the entire oral nutrition of 1,800 kilocalories in the week or so. But our aim should deliver the patient the calculated calories without leaving them caloric deficit in the perioperative period. So whenever we admit the patient for a surgical procedure, our patient used to ask this question: when can I go back to my work? Sending them to home is like winning the battle. Going back to work early is like winning the war. So we can win many battles, but loss of the war is not a good thing to happen. So we have to expect our surgical patient to come strong or don't come at all. Early to work after surgery if he has his lean body mass preserved. If you are able to preserve the lean body mass, then definitely they are able to have a good quality after a surgical procedure. And here comes the different insight into it, the role of perioperative high protein diet. So after addressing the patient's caloric needs in the form of non-protein calories with carbohydrates and lipids, how to deliver the proteins to them? This is called protein rules in the perioperative period. Giving amino acid solution before addressing the caloric needs is a real waste. And many people used to think FFP and albumin are the good source of proteins. Remember, FFP is only to correct hypocoagulopathy, and it is not at all a protein source for our surgical patients. And albumin, the role is very, very limited. The role of albumin is there in the hepatorenal syndrome, and in case of large peritoneal synthesis, and now in the place of hydroxyethyl starch, we are advising albumin as a volume therapy in sepsis. So don't ever try to utilize the source of proteins from the FOP and albumin in a surgical patients. So this is a trial done in the intensive care unit people, intensive care unit patients, and the studies like APANIC trial, EDEN trial, and Arabia trials, no benefits are shown if the protein is delivered to the critically ill patient less than 1 gram per kg per day. And all trials shows if the protein energy increases from 1 grams per kg per day, proportionately, they are able to show the benefits in the form of reducing mortality, in the form of reducing the infective complications, and definitely the high protein of 2 grams per kg per day not only deliver a post-operative period without mortality, but also will give our patient with a preserved lean body mass and to have a good quality in the post-operative period. And after moving from the starvation, how to avoid the iatrogenic starvation in our surgical patients, let us concentrate how to decrease the stress in the perioperative period due to the incision, immobilization, and the pain. Let us all try to find a stress-free surgeries to our surgical patients. Stress and poor nutrition are the two-way road. And if a patient having more stress, they will be poorly nourished, and the poor nourishment will give more stress to them. Pain relief without sedation and with a good amount of mobility is the aim in the perioperative period. Regional anesthesia for abdominal surgeries, epidural is the cornerstone. And if you are practicing the epidural analgesia, you have to titrate the volume and everything to give a patient without sedation and with a good mobility, the walking epidurals. That can be achieved by the high volume of local anesthetic solutions with a very, very minimal concentration. And don't practice the narcotic analgesia in the post-operative period. If at all, use a short-acting fentanyl and aim for a reduction in the nausea, ileus, and immobility. You can add liberal amount of clonidine and dexmedetomidine in the regional anesthesia, ultrasound-guided peripheral nerve blocks to have a good amount of pain relief in the post-operative period without any sedation and with a good amount of mobility can reduce the stress to a greater extent so that the patient end up in having a good nutritional intake. Liberal use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, parenteral paracetamol, and suppositories are the cornerstone to achieve this. Early mobilization definitely put down the stress. So we should go for walking epidurals in the post-operative period, segmental epidural with preserved bladder sensation, and avoid the bladder catheterization even though the patient is on epidural analgesia, tab blocks and other local blocks, no sedatives, no narcotics, and avoid the abdominal drains, and even avoiding the urinary catheter will give the early mobilization to the patient. And once they are early mobilized, they are having a reduced stress, and reduced stress lead to good intake of nutrients. And coming to the IV fluids, when we are concentrating on the nutritional value of IV fluids, at the same time, we should also concentrate the volume of IV fluids is important. Avoid fluid overload, avoid water, and avoid the sodium load on your patient. For a resuscitation, wet is best, but for an elective surgery, balanced is always better. And maintain a cumulative intake output chart, like how you are concentrating on the cumulative caloric deficit, you should concentrate on the intake output chart and avoid positive balance. If your patient started accumulating more and more of positive balance, they will end up in having a paralytic ileus due to the edematous intestines in the perioperative period. And remember, when you are prescribing sodium chloride, you are prescribing poison to your patient. And hence, it is not normal saline, it is an abnormal saline. It's inexpensive, so we are using it more. And it does not contain potassium and magnesium, remember. More than 1 liter per day is injurious to the health. And because of a high content of chloride, our patient will have hyperchloremic acidosis in the postoperative period. And by giving more and more of normal saline by themselves, it leads to the acute kidney injury. So the ability of the patient to get rid of the accumulated sodium is also greatly curtailed in the postoperative period. 9 grams of sodium chloride is equal to 36 bags of chips you are eating, and that is equal to 1 liter of normal saline. So how do we limit the IV fluids and the sodium in our surgical patient? Take the drip down on the first postoperative day and enhance the oral intake on the post-surgical feeding rules. The early enteral feeding is a norm, and don't ever suppress the natural appetite. Whenever a surgical patient asks for a fluid or a sips of water, at least you can encourage that particular limited amount of water at least. And don't put the Ryle's tube as a prophylactic to avoid the paralytic ileus. In case if they develop a paralytic ileus, you can put the Ryle's tube to treat the paralytic ileus, but not to prevent or the prophylactic usage of Ryle's tube. Not to wait for the bubble sounds and the flatus passage to start oral fluids. And if you want to practice this, we have to prevent postoperative nausea and vomiting and take the measures to prevent ileus. And whenever a surgery is done, it's a duty of the perioperative physicians and the surgeons to have a good assess on a surgical patients like feeding jejunostomy, PEG tubes, or at least nasogastric nasoduodenal tubes. Commercial enteral feeds should be encouraged definitely instead of the kitchen feeds like eggs and the peanuts. What is the time frame for the early feeding in a surgical patients? If you are doing it within 24 hours, it is earliest, but do at least within 48 hours of the surgical procedure. The late is always after 7 days. The post of early feeding can have a normal oral diet 2 hours after any regional anesthesia or 4 hours after any surgery is done under general anesthesia. Again and again, we like to stress, don't ever resist or suppress the natural appetite of our surgical patients. Is it really needed the prescription of nil per oral like procedures, TURP, cesarean section, spine surgery, for that matter, in all non-GI surgeries. But remember, in the ERAS protocol, there is no nil per oral, even for a GI surgicals. The association between early postoperative nutritional supplement utilization and length of stay in malnourished hip fractures have been well documented if the patients are given oral supplementary nutrition immediate postoperative period. And early oral protein-containing diets following elective lower gastrointestinal tract surgery is also giving us a good results like reduction in the infective complications, reduction in the hospital stay and the cost. Whenever we talk about prescribing the early nutrition in a surgical patients, we all face an important question. By feeding our Indian population, the Indian people are not same as a Western people. They will have the bloating of abdomen, bloating sensation, and they will definitely complain about the nausea and vomiting, and that will definitely prevent them the early enteral feeding. In that case, it's better to have a scoring system like iFeed scoring system. This will give you a scores from 0 to 6. 0 to 2 is normal, so we can easily give them the early enteral feeding. And if the patient having the score of 3 to 5, you can suspect postoperative GI intolerance and you can go slow on that. And if the patient is having a score of more than 6, we are not going to pressurize them to have the early enteral feeding. And that patients are labeled as a postoperative GI dysfunction and put the Ryle's tube and empty the intestines. And traditionally, we used to practice the post-operative feeding from stop to slow and to go. But we have to practice in the reverse. Go as a normal in all surgical patient. And if you are able to tolerate it with the iFeed scores of 0 to 2, the management is as simple. Encourage them early enteral feeding, and you take care of the post-operative nausea and vomiting. and then you can go as usual. But the same patient, if they complain of difficulty in the oral intake with a belching, nausea, bloated feeling, or sometimes a frank vomiting, then you can go slow and you can step up the antiemetics. You can resume the early enteral feeding once they get tolerated. And if the same patient, the post-surgical period, if they have the high feed scores of more than 6, then you have to really stop your feeding and go for a nasogastric aspiration and so on. To finish off my lecture, so when we are talking about the early enteral feeding in the post-surgical period, Indian scenario, to which food items you can say yes on the immediate post-operative day. And all the food which you are prescribing to your patient or advising them to eat, you should see to that the caloric value of the nutrients. It should contain non-protein and protein calories. Bread butter jam is good. Idli sambar and coconut chutney, it contains all these macronutrients. Idiyappam and then upma, pongal. These are the favorites Indian diets which can be prescribed in the immediate post-operative period. If the patient is non-vegetarian, they can take this type of foods. Where the role of oral nutrient supplements comes. Sorry to just use this commercial slide here. Whenever you are using the oral nutrient supplementation in a smaller volume, you can achieve a good amount of calories to them. For an example, 13 grams of protein with the 26 vitamins and minerals and good amount of non-protein calories in the form of 350 calories you can achieve by 200 ml with the 2 or 3 scoops of oral nutrient supplements. So whenever the patient is not able to take enough diet in the post-operative period due to the various reasons like from the nausea to the ileus, you can give them the oral nutrient supplements to achieve the caloric need of the patient. Thank you.
Over to you, Dr. Sriram. Dr. Vijay Kumar, you can, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Just thumbs up if you can hear me all right. Okay, so Dr. Vijay Kumar, you've done a fantastic job, and without seeming to be very patronizing, it is as good as any talk we have ever heard in any international meeting. And you have covered everything very nicely. But I have a few comments which I need to spend about 3 to 4 minutes with you. The first thing is what Dr. Vijay Kumar says is nothing new. We've been saying it for about 10 to 20 years. When Vijay Kumar was a young man and when I had more hair, we used to say the same thing. Now it has taken over 30 years. And if for 30 years, we still have surgeons in every part of the world, in India, in America, everywhere, who do not follow what we just heard, then something is wrong. It shouldn't take 30 years to change certain philosophies. So what the major societies have now said is, our job is actually to educate not only surgeons and physicians, but nurses and dietitians, especially nurses, about which I'll come to in a minute. But our experience has been, Vidya, that unless we have administrative support, you cannot do anything. Because administration will only support surgeons and other physicians who bring in revenue to the hospital, not necessarily based upon evidence-based medicine. Okay, this is a big problem. So one of the talks that I give all over the world is team building. For example, even a senior surgeon like a senior physician like Vijay Kumar can look into the eye of a recent, of a surgeon and say, sir, what you're doing is medical malpractice. You should not be doing it. But everyone won't do it because you have to worry about the job. So I am very bold. I tell people this is a medical malpractice if you want to wait for bowel sounds and you are delaying feeding. Now, I'm very happy we heard about the ERAS protocol, Enhanced Recovery After Surgery, and I would encourage more and more hospitals to follow the enhanced recovery of surgery. I'm happy to tell you, in a private hospital in Coimbatore, the patient cannot go to surgery unless there is a nutrition clearance. In addition to cardiology and anesthesiology clearance, you need a nutrition clearance. So preoperative nutrition is very, very important. ERAS protocol, 10 days prior to surgery, anesthesiologist must refuse to give anesthesia to a patient if the patient has not been evaluated nutritionally prior to surgery. Now, I'm very happy Dr. Vijay Kumar told us about the uselessness of albumin. Albumin mainly has non-essential amino acids, and yet you will find physicians who will not give 150 rupees worth of an enteral formula, but give 4,000 rupees worth of albumin to patients. And it is one of the most abused medications that are being used. We also heard about obese patients being sarcopenic. And for the audience here, I want to encourage the use of ultrasound for the detection of sarcopenia. I'll be happy to share all the references with you. In India, unlike other countries, ultrasound can only be used by a physician. It cannot be used by a non-physician. Okay? So, Dr. Vijay Kumar, I can give you the papers. It's a great study to do, Vidya, you too. How to detect sarcopenia in an ICU patient, 3-4 days. The quadriceps femoris muscle mass is all we are asking for. And there are a lot, in many countries, physiotherapists and dietitians use the ultrasound. We cannot use it in India, but I want to, that's been a very favorite topic of mine. So albumin is useless. Now, proteins are more important than glucose. In other words, people make a big deal, dietitians make a big deal about how many calories. Even God does not know how many calories our post-operative patient needs. It is a protein. What is important is if the protein requirement is met, 1.5 grams to 2 grams, then the amount of calories you give a patient becomes less important. Not that it is not important, it becomes less important. So we have to give proteins. Now, I told you that albumin is misused a lot in India and various Asian countries, but the other most misused medication is parenteral nutrition. 95% of patients can be given enteral feeding. If you use the ERAS protocol and early enteral feeding and preoperative detection, then the complication rates will be very low and parenteral nutrition will be used less. In fact, literature has shown if you use parenteral nutrition inappropriately, within 5 days after admission to an intensive care unit, the mortality is actually quadruple. So you should not be using enteral nutrition. And the lovely discussion that we heard from our speaker about the muscle wasting, about the proteins being broken down, is thwarted only by early enteral feeding, not with parenteral nutrition. So we should avoid using parenteral nutrition. It is an absolute waste of money when we use TPN for total parenteral nutrition for no other reason. Now, one of the things, two other quick points I have to tell you. One is we must think about continuum of care, not only the preoperative phase, but after the patient is discharged. Studies that we have done here have shown that if you give oral supplements to patients 30 days after discharge, the readmission and complication rate up to 90 days is avoided. Now, the final comment I have to make before the thing is, please don't use blenderized kitchen prepared diets anymore. The practice has been given up decades ago. It is actually more costly to do that than to give scientific formulas. I prefer not to use the word commercial formulas because it brings a commerciality into it. It's actually the scientific formulas. The final point is we have neglected nurses in many of our discussions in every hospital. And unless the nurses are educated about the importance of nutrition and whatever we heard about lack of bowel sounds and so on, we are not going to achieve anything. Because I've seen instances where the physician would have said, okay, you can start eating the very next day after a procedure. A nurse comes there, especially the senior people, senior nurses. Oh, what nonsense is this? This physician is a young person. Just because he listened to a lecture by Dr. Vijay Kumar, he's asking you to take, I've been a nurse for 30 years. What? Feed a patient without bowel sounds? You just had a gastrointestinal anastomosis. You know, stomach, how can you have it? Who's to tell the nurse in bariatric surgery, in a gastric sleeve resection, the entire greater curve of the stomach is taken off, the patient is fed within 2 days. So nurses have to be educated, Vidya, in many of your programs. No point what we say. So the nurse will tell the patient, you know, I don't believe in all that. You just tell the doctor you vomited, and then he won't feed you. You know, I've never heard about feeding a post-operative patient. Therefore, please follow the nurses also. And I am done, and over to you, Vidya.
Over to you, Biju. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Dr. PC, just before comments, I want to ask you to explain one point. You are talking about glucose loading and the insulin resistance, reduction in insulin resistance. Can you elaborate that point once again?
That's what, sir. When we prescribe the carbohydrate loading just 2 hours before the surgical procedure, we used to have many queries from the staff nurses to the diabetologist, and they used to refuse to load the patients with the carbohydrates. And comes to the point of water loading. Even the anesthesiologist used to have a second thought of feeding them just 2 hours before with 400 ml of water. Because we are all afraid. From our college days, we have been taught about the Mendelssohn syndrome. And actually, we are worried about the aspiration pneumonia during the induction of anesthesia. And for that, we used to keep the patient overnight starvation. And we like to have them the starve for 24 hours also. But when you prescribe the carbohydrate feeding with a volume of 400 ml and 800 ml just before the surgical procedure in the major surgeries, they used to inquire what will happen to the glycemic status in the post-operative period. Because we are having a tough period in controlling the sugar and bringing them to the surgeries. And the surgery is going to be the major surgery. And if you're prescribing them the carbohydrates, what will happen to the glycemic status in the post-operative period? But the studies have shown very clearly, it is a reduction of the 50% of the glycemic fluctuations. The patient used to have a good glycemic control. The take-home point is the stress during the perioperative period of starving and the stress during the surgical procedure, that is the culprit of raising the sugars in the post-operative period, not the carbohydrate loading. By giving them the carbohydrate load just 2 hours before, like a sprinter going for a 100-meter race, like a surgical patient coming for a major surgeries, they have a good energy preservation and they have a good protein utilization in the post-operative period, and they end up in having a good glycemic control. Even in a diabetic patient, we are obviously seeing a good glycemic control in the post-operative period if they have a carbohydrate loading.
Okay, thank you for that. And my second, I invite one more comment from you. Very happy to say that you use the word of two-third. Two-third patients are problematic. Okay, they have this malnutrition. I think nutrition community, we start again getting reminded of this two-third. Whenever we do survey, this two-third is again and again popping up in India. Two-thirds problematic, two-thirds will malnutrition, everything is a two-third. So in that context, I wanted to ask you, when we generally talk about perioperative nutrition, within your 20 years experience, have you started emphasizing more on the pre-op nutrition than post-op? What is the message you want to give? You want to, over 20 years.
I honestly accept
Yeah.
we are not able to execute the pre-operative nutrition in our surgical patients because the nutritional assessment is not practiced in many of the hospitals, including of ours. And the patients are in a hurry. If you say to them, you improve your nutrition and come for a surgical procedure, they laugh at you. But they are not ready to wait to increase their weight and come for a surgical procedure. And most of the time in a surgeries, even the surgeons and the anesthesiologist used to take the albumin level as the guideline. If the patient is having a good albumin, maybe around more than 3 grams per deciliter, all of us are very happy to take the patient for a surgical procedure. But the albumin will get reduced only when the patient is severely malnourished. And actually, we need a nutritional assessments, the subjective global assessment, whatever the nutritional scale you can take and assess your patient before a surgical procedure, you can come to a conclusion that your patient may have a severe malnutrition or moderately malnourished. And that is the way of assessing the nutritional state of our surgical patients. And even if you have an assessment, when the patient falls into the category of moderately malnourished, and it is not the duty of us to compel them to have a nutritional support for at least 7 days before a surgical procedure. So it's very difficult. Honestly, we all have to accept the pre-operative nutritional support, even in a malnourished patient, before bringing them for a surgical procedure is very difficult to achieve in an Indian scenario.
Dr. Krishnan Sriram wants to say something. Viju,
please.
to comment on this. Yeah, Dr. Sriram. You have to unmute, sir.
Yes, I want to comment on exactly what we heard earlier. I know it is very difficult, Vijay Kumar, but if we are frank with the patient and we tell the patient, if I am the patient or my relative is a patient, I will not advise you to have surgery. You can even die from it. Many patients will agree. Of course, you might chase away the patient. They'll go somewhere else and find someone else. It is true. But I think it is morally wrong. It is medical malpractice, put it that way. It is a medical malpractice even for an anesthesiologist to accept to give anesthesia when you know that the risk is very high. Now, a quick word about albumin. I've been saying that the albumin is absolutely useless even to check it. Now, you might hear Dr. Paul Wischmeyer and other people say different things, but albumin has neither a positive predictive value nor a negative predictive value. We have given up albumin as a marker of nutrition, given up. And to support that, I'm very happy to tell you, my friends, that 3 months ago, the American Society of Parenteral Nutrition issued a position statement so that people don't have to argue with it anymore, saying don't use albumin as a nutritional marker. It is a stress marker. No one denies the fact. But just because a patient's albumin level is normal doesn't mean anything, neither a positive or a negative predictive value. So there again, if the surgeon comes and tells you, Vijay Kumar, of course, a surgeon like Dr. Radhakrishnan is not going to tell you those things. If somebody else tells you, well, the albumin is normal, you say, well, here is the literature, to support that it is not there. But I agree with you. It's not an easy task because we run into the same problem in our hospitals also. Just isolated 1 or 2 folks who don't follow the evidence. Thank you.
Dr. PC, last question. In your experience, what do you feel about the utility of frailty and sarcopenia in a clinical setting? How practical it is, and what is the challenge we are going to face when we put into bedside practice?
So definitely, sir, because I am sitting in a single hospital, though it is a very small hospital when compared to the bigger hospitals like yours, I am seeing patients coming in the post-operative period also. I like you to see my post-operative patients quite often. The people who are not addressed nutritionally, I'm obviously seeing them coming with a deficit. They are not going back to the work normally, and they are having a poor quality of life in the post-operative period. And if the nutrition is addressed very nicely, and very honestly, I like to accept, only 10 to 15% of the people, patient side, they are accepting for the nutritional support. If you say to them, you are not able to take adequate calories and the proteins through your diet, what you are taking, better accept a smaller tube through the nose into the stomach, and we will feed you and see to that you will have a good nutritional support. Even in a burns patients, even in a post-surgical patients, the malnourished people coming with a bed sore and flap corrections and everything, we are not able to achieve that enteral supplementation to them. They are very much afraid of the tube through the nose and into the stomach. And in spite of repeated counseling, we are not able to make them accepting this tube for a good nutritional support. So after that, we are seeing the rejections of the grafts so quite commonly, and rejection of the flap commonly, and the wound is not healing with the surgical site infections commonly coming up. And the patient end up in having many problems in the post-operative period, from the infected complications to the lethargy and everything. And I'm seeing it commonly. And if you address the nutritional support to them in the perioperative period, though I cannot say you that 100% they are coming out with a good quality of life in the post-operative period, I can very obviously see a good recovery in a patient who have really had a good nutritional support in the perioperative period.
Krishna, back to you. Dr. Radhakrishna?
Yeah, and at that point with Dr. Vijay Kumar is discussing that we can't implement pre-operative nutrition because Dr. Vijay Kumar and myself work in the private sector. Patients are in a hurry, they can't wait. They don't understand in the first place. And we can't have a patient have pre-operative nutritional correction for a week or 10 days and then come back to say they don't, because in the corporate sector, this doesn't happen. Unlike yours, Biju, that you can have a patient occupying a bed any number of days to have nutrition. That's a major issue. And again, when 70% of the medical practice in India in the corporate sector, I do not know how to implement that. I don't know. The Krishnan Sriram can give some suggestions, and you can give suggestions as well as to how we can do it in the private sector.
So this concept about private sectors has been well addressed in many publications, Radhakrishnan. Okay, Radhakrishna, I can send you those things too. The reason is many times what happens is the patient is seen in the private clinics of the surgeon, and the surgeon then admits them to the corporate hospital only for doing a procedure. You see, so the default way by which the patient is admitted to the hospital, the screening, the patient has to pass the nutritional screening. Now, the thing I would tell you is that years ago when I was actually working in India also, if this was a patient who's our relative, would we do the operation? When we know that it is not right, would we do the operation? Will the anesthesiologist give anesthesia to somebody when we know that is morally wrong? You see, morally wrong. Where is our conscience? And then the patient ends up with a complication and all that. So I think it is a question of being brutally honest. I agree with you totally. It's so difficult to balance between our job in the hospital, making sure that the beds are full and making sure that administration is happy. That's why I told you earlier. Now, for those 10 days where the patient has to wait, if they come 400 miles away, it is very difficult. I agree with you. You see? And then for medical malpractice reasons, I can tell you, if the patient, our job is to tell the patient, this is what we advise. If you don't take our advice, you're going to run these complications. Do you understand it? And document it in the chart. Otherwise, I can tell you, the patient can sue with a complication of a bowel leak or a fistula and go to court and say, Your Honor, there are 20 publications here to say that that preoperative nutritional care is important. Early post-op as well. My grandfather never had it. It's a complication. How can we defend ourselves? It is medical malpractice. And therefore, documentation saying we discuss with the patient. Finally, it is patient-centric. I perfectly agree with you. So it's a long answer and maybe the wrong answer for a very short question. It is very, very difficult. It is not a problem in India alone. It's a problem in various Asian countries, including America. Thank you.
If I can ask PCV the same question, do you ever refuse a patient saying that patient needs nutritional improvement before taking up a surgery? Vidya, do you ever do that, saying this patient is not nutritionally fit, it's an elective surgery, why don't we improve nutrition, then only I'll give anesthesia? Have you ever refused, Vidya?
No, I'm guilty of never having said that.
Right.
I've never done that.
PCV.
I also honestly accept, because we are a surgeon friendly, not a patient friendly. As an anesthesiologist, to have a good practice in India, in the metropolitan cities like Chennai, you have to be a surgeon's friends. You're not to be a patient friendly.
Sir, you should preach what you practice.
That's true. That's true, actually. I can preach my surgeons to accept their modality of treatments. And I honestly accept you here. The main problem which I am facing in my own institution, and with the news I am gathered from all other people in many parts of our country, all the people are having the uniform opinion. It is the physicians who are not get convinced about the perioperative nutrition, for that matter, nutritional support in a hospitalized patients. So it is our duty to change. Yeah, they keep on saying, as my mentor, Dr. Sriram said, 30 years we are blowing this trumpet. Every meeting, the same words, everything has been repeated. And I'm just accepting the fact that we are not able to convince my own surgical friends to start the early enteral nutrition. They will accept in front of me, but they will go and tell to the staff nurses not to start it. That is what we used to commonly come across. So being a learning general surgical group here, I expect more of the surgeons here in this particular meeting. And if any one of them go and change their practice of allowing a lap cholecystectomy patient to take a oral feeds immediate post-operative period, or any TURP patients or the cesarean section patient not withholding their own patients from the appetite which they have in the post-operative period, when they ask the surgeons, can I have a fluid? Can I have a sips of water? If they say no, there is no meaning of this particular meeting. So I come to know that 60 to 70 people are there in this meeting, and 20 to 30 people at least I expect to be a surgical population. And if one or two surgeons change their practice tomorrow and allowing the patients to have an early enteral feeding or the pre-operative nutritional support, that is going to be the success. So we have to aim with such webinars and such educational activities to promote this concept and make them to accept it. It's only the physicians, the anesthesiologists to practice no pre-medication, the anesthesiologists to avoid all the pre-medication drugs, the anesthesiologists to practice the nerve blocks, epidural analgesia, and stress prevention and everything. The surgeons to practice not to put a drain, not to have the patients with Rayleigh tubes, not to have the patients sitting ideal on the bed for 2 to 3 days. Even if they move, they used to say that take rest, don't move, your stitch will give away. If you take water, your stomach will blow up. I had done a surgery in your intestines. If you take diet, the intestines will break away and you will have other complications. They used to threaten them not to have the feeds. And if suppose we all change our practice, definitely our patients are all going to get benefited in the post-operative period, and we are far, far away from the enhanced recovery after the surgical procedures.
Sir, I'll also be happy. With a minute, I'll also be happy if there are anesthesiologists who are watching this program uniformly say, just like, potassium is high, we can't give, sodium is low, we can't give, nutrition is low, we can't give, then we have no choice but to accept, sir. If all the anesthetists come together and they decide that patient is not nutritionally fit and, in a corporate sector, then I think we'll all have to fall in line.
If that change comes, definitely it's a benefit is for all of us. As a surgeon who had done the surgery, if our patient is going to have a good outcome, you're going to be very happy. If I, as an anesthesiologist and the perioperative physician, if I am seeing my patients after surgical procedure come back with a good quality of life after 2 or 3 months, we are going to be very happy. So if we all together work for that, then I can also refuse and you will also will oblige.
I just wanted to say that, we try to, though Vijay Kumar said about winning the battle and losing the war, but what we have tried to do is, win small battles. Like first change ourselves, like we have at least consciously stopped keeping patients long-term NPO, and most of the people who have been working with me over the past 25 years, I've managed to convince them. So everyone specifically writes that you have solid meal 6 hours before, you can have clear liquids 2 hours before, like prescriptive. It's not just enough to write, because if you tell the patient and don't write, the nurse won't allow, or vice versa. So that is one thing. Similarly, early post-op oral intake, like we don't allow anyone to on 2 hours after oral, unless the surgeon specifically says no. And wherever possible, we try to convince the surgeon also what is the problem, like let the patient have. And as far as intraoperative things are concerned, people like Vijay Kumar and I definitely tell the surgeon, do you really need the Rayleigh tube? Can I take it off? Okay, you needed it intra, but can I take it off? Or do you really need the drain? Or things like that. Little bit of suggestive things we can do. Insisting on a preoperative when we are being pressurized to operate on patients whose glycemic control is poor, or there's not even an HbA1c done. No, we'll give insulin and get the sugar all right, and then we can go ahead with the surgery. That's the response. So given or give an antihypertensive and we'll bring the blood pressure down and do the surgery. That is the level where we are. At that stage, to expect us to get a proper nutritional assessment done and then reject patients based on nutritional assessment is at all. I mean, it's a good target to have, but I think the small battles will eventually help us win the war. That's what I feel. Okay, it's taking longer than we thought, but that was like. And
There are some
Biju,
questions
you
in the
asked
chat
your
box.
questions, but we didn't hear your comment.
Yeah, Biju.
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat box.
Dr. Sriram wanted to make a comment before we go to the question. Sir, Sriram.
Just a quick comment. As Dr. Vijayakumar said, the purpose of meetings like this that we are having is so that we can change. We are not going to change. We are not going to change the entire world. We're not going to change the entire country. We're not going to change the entire city of Chennai. We can only change within our own islands of excellence in your practice, in your hospital. You see, that is all you can say. So now this is all by experience. It has come out because many of the societies have started deciding, why the hell are we wasting money on programs? We're going to be saying the same thing again and again. And then they have found that it is the patient who has to be educated. It is the patient who says, well, my grandfather had surgery by Dr. Radhakrishna, and Vijayakumar gave the anesthesia, and then they were home on the third day. And someone else had a hysterectomy and they are still in the hospital, lying down in the bed like this for the 5 days. And we all went to anatomy. We all studied 1.5 years of anatomy. Since when is the GU tract connected anatomically with the GI tract? To keep a patient NPO after hysterectomy is just ludicrous. So now the fact is, how do we change it? The changing is through the patient. I can only tell you, those of us who are listening to us, if you can change your practice and you won't do it for your family, that slowly that will change little by little. It can change. You see, I'm not denying that it is going to be a hard task. Now, every meeting I go to, some of you are meeting, there'll always be 1 or 2 people in the audience. Out of the 60 people who have joined here, honestly, Vidya, not everybody is going to change. Okay, maybe 40 of them may want to change. Of the 40, I would say half of them are not given the opportunity to change. Because another doctor comes and says, what does he know? He just graduated. He just got his MS 5 years ago. I've been in practice for 35 years. You see what I mean? That is why it is very important that the education be done also for nurses. The entire system in the hospital has to change. It may be easy for me to sit here and say it. I agree with you. I agree it is easy to say. But let us try to change within our own small islands, and it will be achieved.
Biju, will you take up the questions from the chat box on where the faculty will? Yeah, the first question, if I can start, what is the ideal time to introduce lipid emulsion in post-op patients, Dr. PCV?
It's a time when you are prescribing your patients the dextrose electrolyte solutions. We already discussed about the combined regimen. See, the first, as Dr. Sriram has pointed out very clearly, the parenteral nutrition is a harmful thing. We cannot give more and more of parenteral nutrition. For an example, if your patient is a well-nourished patient coming for a herniorrhaphy, then you can give them the dextrose electrolyte solution for first day. Second day, you can start them on the early enteral feedings. But the same patient is a malnourished, moderately malnourished, and they have not had any feeding for the last 7 days, either due to this disease per se, or due to the poor appetite and all other things. If they are not able to achieve the 7 days of nutrition, then you can start the lipid emulsions even the day 1 itself. With the carbohydrates, only 300 to 500 ml of lipid emulsions will take care of the caloric deficit to a little extent. Of course, if you want to address the exact calories calculated for your pertaining patient, then you have to combine carbohydrates, fat, and proteins. Then it is going to be a total parenteral nutrition on the first day. And the first day of total parenteral nutrition is better to be avoided. And you can wait for at least 2 or 3 days in the postoperative period to start them on the TPN. But adding fat emulsions, I don't think a big harm, because it's going to be a dual energy for the surgical patients to cut down the caloric needs. And we have a good lipid emulsions now. In those days, intralipid causing so many problems to us. The intralipid from the soy oil preparations, they used to have the cholestasis, jaundice, and all other complications. But when you have a SMOF lipids, I think it can address all the needs of a surgical patients. The essential fatty acids is there that can promote the wound healing, and it contains the immunonutrients from the fish oil. The olive oil is the antioxidant. So with a combination of all the four in a one single bottle, the SMOF lipid, it can address very good to the surgical patients.
So the second question is, what kind of carbonated drink you use in your daily practice?
As I've already told you, when we don't add the commercial preparations like maltodextrins, we used to give our patients only glucose, the plain glucose, but that will delay the gastric emptying, because we are like a maltodextrins, if you take, within 2 hours, it will be moved on to the pylorus from the stomach. But if you give glucose, you can increase the safety margin to the 4 hours, and plain glucose can be given 4 hours with a 400 ml of water. But now we are fortunate to have a humpy number of commercial feeds for the carbohydrate loading. And you can take any one of them and you can give them to the patient.
Okay, the next question is, many of the patients undergo CT scan for surgery otherwise. Can we use it for measuring the sarcopenia?
Yeah, that can be used. That will give you an idea just in the pre-operative period, how much of lean body they are having. But our idea is, once the patient underwent the surgery and in the post-operative period, how effective your nutritional support to them can be assessed by at least a weekly once of a quadriceps muscle thickness in the ultrasound. So the ultrasound is very handy. And whenever you want to check the muscle thickness, the quadriceps is very handy. So you can put the probe in the quadriceps and you can feel the thickness of the quadriceps muscle. And that will give you an idea. If suppose the quadriceps is decreasing, and then you can say that your nutritional support is not adequate, or for that matter, your protein supplementation is not adequate. So you can enhance your protein supplementation to the patients. And now they have a glycogen scores. The glycogen scores in the muscles from the ultrasound. There are specific softwares are available. And with that, they can identify the glycogen scores. In a critically ill patient, the glycogen stores depletes very fast. And once you start seeing the glycogen appearance in the muscle mass, then you can say that they are moving from the acute stage to the chronic stage. And there you can supplement them a good amount of proteins. And now we are liberally using the anabolic materials like the propranolol, anabolic steroids to increase the lean body mass once they come out of the acute phase, the surgical acute phase or the critical care acute phase. When they move on to the chronic phase, then we can add them the anabolic materials for them to retain the proteins. So the ultrasound examination will be handy. Instead of having a CT scan every time, you can have an ultrasound examination of your quadriceps muscle thickness. That will give a good idea.
The last question I'll read as such, you can interpret. How to deal with overnutrition type of malnutrition?
I think they are talking about the obesity.
Yeah.
Like we already discussed, and one of my slide, I pointed it out, because many people who have a good amount of good knowledge on the nutrition, they used to think, why should we feed an obese patient in the perioperative period? After all, they are weighing 100 kilograms. What is the big thing they are going to lose when they are having a weight reduction from 100 to 90? That's going to be the benefit for them. It is not actually. Actually, they will end up in having a sarcopenia. They will have the fat retained and losing all the proteins after the surgical procedure. So the overweight individuals are the notorious people to have a sarcopenia in the postoperative period. And those people are the special people to have a protein addressed normal.
Okay, there is one more question. Is there any problem with the too much protein?
Yes, of course. Anything is too much is going to harm our body. Proteins cannot be supplemented too much. When the patient, especially having a renal impairment, there we have to cut down the proteins. And there also, you have to identify the amino acid profile of your protein, what you're going to give to your patient. For an example, in a renal failure patient, we have a set of amino acids preferred. For a hepatic failure patient, we have a set branch chain amino acids as a preparations preferred. So like that, you can choose the amino acid profile. Like how we choosing the fatty acid profile in a fat emulsions, you can choose the amino acid profile for your patients when they have a diseases like renal failure, hepatic failure. In those individuals, we have to be very careful. This 1.5 grams to 2 grams per kg per day is for a normal patients, and you have to be very careful in some set of people.
Back to you, Dr. Vidya and Dr. Bhatta.
Yeah, I have one important question to all the three faculty. If a slightly deviated question, because I think in India, in nutrition, we come a long way thanks to continuous effort, Dr. Krishnan Sriram for the last 2-3 decades, and Vijay Kumar, and you, Briju, now. We have good kitchens, we have a good dietetics department, but somehow we don't seem to gel. There's no system, because there's a communication gap between the treating physicians and the dietitians and the nursing personnel and so on, when there are some very well-oiled mechanisms elsewhere in the world. So I just want to know, why are we not forging ahead in this area? What is the ideal formula, both in the corporate sector and in the public sector? I'll ask you, Dr. Krishnan Sriram, because he's seen some good systems running around the world, but somehow here many of us don't see eye to eye.
Yeah, so a couple of minutes. About the public system, I think Biju is a far better person to work to answer the question about the public sector, but it depends on state to state. In some states, for example, the positions of a dietitian has been even abandoned. And the understanding that dietitians are both clinical dietitians and food services, that concept is not there, and that has to really change. So there's a lot of commercialism in private hospitals, where the cost of the food for the patient is merged with the room charges, and therefore when the patient is asked to take supplements, then they think it is addition. But I'm happy to tell you that many insurance companies are now paying for supplements also. They are beginning to pay for the nutritional care of patients. So I think that is the main reason. That is the main thing that is actually happening. That there is a commercialism involved here over which we don't have much control. Now, as long as I have this thing, if I have your permission, Dr. Radhakrishna, I want to humbly disagree with our speaker, PC Vijay Kumar, knowing that he cannot throw tomatoes at me because I'm far away. He's not going to throw rotten eggs or tomatoes at me. There is absolutely no reason to give lipids with dextrose or solution in the postoperative period. No literature supports it. If the patient needs parenteral nutrition, you give parenteral nutrition. You see, but just giving lipids with dextrose alone in the postoperative period is, I've not heard about it, it's not scientific. Secondly, there is no evidence, current recommendations do not advocate the use of anabolic hormones. I would strongly discourage that, because use anabolic hormones is a greater risk of deep vein thrombosis. It is not supported by the literature. There is no literature to support the use of beta blockers and anabolic steroids, except in conditions like cancer, burns, and HIV. Those are the only 3 approved conditions, not others. And lastly, there is absolutely no benefit of hepatic formulas. Even that has been weeded out, at least in the American guidelines. They say that there is no use. The usual formulas have 25% branched chain amino acids. Hepatic formula have 45% branched chain, but they cost 2 to 3 times more. And it does not help. It does not help in mortality. It might cut down the hepatic encephalopathy for 1 or 2 days, but doesn't cut mortality. So Dr. Vijay Kumar, you are a great speaker, but I have to humbly tell you, our job is to give evidence-based medicine to our thing. And I don't want folks to go ahead and use anabolic hormones for everyone. I know exactly why you said it. You listened to someone's talk on it, but it has been highly criticized that there is no role for beta blockers, no role for anabolic hormones. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I took this opportunity to
No
barge in.
problem. No problem.
Yeah, I'll go to
Why
Dr.
do you
Vijay
have
Kumar. Vidya, the question has to be answered by 2 more people. I'll go to Vijay Kumar. How does the nutrition system work? How does in your hospital? Who's the lead? How do you coordinate and how it's implemented?
It's very difficult to implement that. If, for example, if you take the Indian Association of Parental Enteral Nutrition, we love to introduce a concept like hospital nutrition steering committees. I was the chairman for this hospital nutrition steering committee in the IAPN when they introduced it. So I want to try it in my own hospital, because before preaching to the other hospitals to have a hospital nutrition steering committees, why don't we try in our own hospitals? But I failed in doing that, because hospital administration thinks that by promoting the hospital's nutrition steering committees, including the kitchen people, including the cook, including the new dietitians, the surgeons, and the canteen people, and all the other people, including them in the hospital nutrition steering committees, they think that we are all doing it in a commercial basis. We want to gain something out of this particular concept. So that is why he is promoting. And that is why the hospital is going to lose something. Let us function separately. Let the kitchen function separately. Let the dietitians function separately. And let the doctors, like anesthesiologists and the surgeons, do their job separately. We are not able to bring them all in a board in the hospital nutrition steering committee. And I failed in my own hospitals. So it's very difficult to get all the people in board. And even if you get the people and start functioning for a day or at least for a month, we get so many complaints from so many angles, and we are not able to withstand that particular pressure, and finally end up having a failure in executing the hospital nutrition steering committees in our own hospitals.
Biju, how do you deal with this? Where did you succeed?
Yeah, I'll just talk from my experience. Probably I also thought so years back. So last 8 years, just 4 things I will emphasize. We need to conduct orientation program. That's very important, very frequent. Last 8 years, we have conducted 62 orientation programs in with respect to clinical nutrition, assessment, PN, EN, and all that. Many of you might have already participated. In these programs, in our hospital, around approximate 360 nurses in our hospital, one day or another day has participated in these programs. Okay. So this is one of the very cornerstones to change the practice. Third is, in your system, when you introduce 2 category of people are very important. You need a nutritionist who are part of your team. It should not be a rotation basis, who understand what is your specialty and all that. Second thing is, you have to catch and take the confidence of your in-charge nurse. I'm just telling from my practical experience. This in-charge nurse is converted, the clock ticks to your side. That makes a huge difference. So these first 3 points. The 4th point I wanted to tell you that entire team, including up to the staff nurse and the ward boy, let them familiarize with all the nutritional products. Let the 3-chamber bag be around the ward. Let there be all nutrition products, commercial preparation around the ward. So we also try to keep something called a blue nutrition tray near the bedside of every patient. So there will be something in that, some vitamin tablets will there, something will be there always. So this will keep on, this will remind everybody that we are committed to nutrition, and everybody should be familiar with all the nutrition products. For this, barring commercial interest, we need an excellent contact and a relation with the company. So industry support is also very important. I think even in resource constraint setup, it is possible. That is what our experience shows. It is possible. It will reduce, from our experience, I can very certainly say that it will reduce the morbidity. It will reduce the hospital stay. It will make the patient back to his normal life soon. It will make a change, because I have worked in 2 systems, very excellent, 2 big hospitals, where one hospital, I'm not naming, one hospital there is absolutely very less care about the nutrition. Another where we developed much more care in the nutritional aspect. Same type of surgeries, the outcome is very, very different. So this we can make a change. I think with others, I should give a hope we can make a change.
Thanks for that, Viju. I was just trying to say that the whole idea of having Viju and Dr. Sriram was to have counterpoints as well. Like, there's no point if all of you agree on everything. So that was the purpose. So
Always better to bring the surgeons on board when you are discussing the nutritional support in the surgical patients, because they are the people to definitely understand about the benefits of the nutritional aspect for the surgical patients. So they are the idea of this particular meet. If suppose they are taking some messages, take home messages, it's going to be the success for this particular meeting.
thank you, Dr. Vijay Kumar. Thank you for the nice talk, as well as patiently answering all queries. Thank you, Dr. Sriram and Viju, for taking time off and really stoking the discussion. And thanks everyone for those who joined in, and hope you got at least 2 or 3 take-home points and some things that you can implement right away tomorrow on your first patient on the list. So good night, everyone. Take care and stay safe. We'll meet again next Thursday with another episode of Marvelous Medicine.
I like this punctuality, doctor.
Thank you.
Started at 8 o'clock and finished at exactly 9:30.
That's Vidya for you.
That's marvelous.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.